The cards hit the table like gunshots. In a smoke-choked Montana saloon where desperation wore 1,000 faces, Rhett Calder just made the worst bet of his life. Or the best. While hardened men laughed and whiskey flowed, he traded his last shred of dignity for a woman bound in chains, dismissed as worthless cargo in a rigged game. But in her exhausted eyes burned something the frontier had tried to kill: defiance. What started as one reckless hand would ignite a firestorm that would shake the entire territory to its foundations. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The November wind cut through Bitterroot Junction like a drunk man's promise, cold, sharp, and mean. It rattled the warped boards of Sullivan's saloon, sending fingers of frost creeping beneath the door where mud and blood had long since stained the planks darker than any intentional finish. Inside, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke, cheap whiskey, and the particular stench of men who'd stopped caring what anyone thought about them. Rhett Calder sat at a corner table, his back to the wall, always to the wall, with 3 cards face down before him and a pile of coins that wouldn't buy a decent meal. His hat sat low enough to shadow eyes that had seen too much and forgotten too little. At 34, he carried the kind of weathered look that made strangers guess 45, the kind of tired that went bone deep and soul deeper. "Your bet, Calder." The voice belonged to Marcus Grieve, a cattle hauler with hands like sledgehammers, and a reputation for leaving card games richer than he entered them, one way or another. 3 other men rounded out the table: a railroad surveyor named Patterson, who picked his teeth with a silver toothpick, a freight company foreman called Dutch, whose neck was thicker than most men's thighs, and a skeletal prospector everyone knew as Skinny Pete, though nobody remembered his real name anymore. Rhett studied his cards without really seeing them. A pair of 8s, weak hand, weaker position. But tonight wasn't about winning. It was about staying in motion, staying present, staying anything but alone with his thoughts in that hollow homestead 10 miles north where the ghosts were getting louder. "Fold!" Patterson tossed his cards down with disgust. "Same." Dutch followed suit, reaching for his whiskey. That left Grieve, Skinny Pete, and Rhett. The pot had grown uglier than the night outside. $47, a silver pocket watch, a claim deed to a worked-out copper vein, and something else. Something that made the room's ambient noise drop whenever anyone looked at it too long. A person. She sat on a wooden bench against the far wall, wrists bound with hemp rope that had worn her skin raw. Her dress, if you could call the tattered gray remnant a dress, hung on a frame that spoke of missed meals and hard traveling. Dirt streaked her face, but it couldn't hide the sharp angles of intelligence beneath the exhaustion. Couldn't fully mask the particular kind of fury that came from being treated like cargo. Her name, Rhett had heard earlier, was Lydia Vale. Or that's what the man who'd brought her in had claimed. A tobacco-stained trader named Silas Crown who'd lost her in the previous hand to Grieve on a bluff that everyone saw through except Grieve himself, who'd been drunk enough to call it anyway. "Human trafficking's illegal," the surveyor had muttered when Crown first shoved her forward as collateral. "Ain't trafficking," Crown had snarled. "She's bond labor, indentured legal-like for debts owed, got papers." Nobody asked to see the papers. Nobody wanted to know if they were real. This far from any territorial court, law was whatever men with guns agreed it was. And nobody present felt like making that argument on behalf of a woman they didn't know. Rhett had watched it all with the detached interest of a man who'd stopped believing in justice around the same time he'd buried his wife and daughter 3 winters past. That coldness, that distance, had kept him alive when others better than him had gone under. It was armor. It was prison. It was all he had left. "Call or fold, Calder." Grieve leaned back, confident. "And let me tell you, I ain't folding. Got 3 pretty ladies keeping me company." He tapped his cards, grinning around a cigar that probably cost more than Rhett's boots. Skinny Pete's eyes darted between his cards and the pot. His pile was the shortest, $6 and change. I'm out." He threw down his hand, relieved. Just Rhett and Grieve now. The saloon had grown quiet. Even the piano player had stopped his off-key butchering of Lorena to watch. Moments like this were entertainment worth pausing for, watching a man stake his last dollar on cardboard and hope. Rhett's gaze drifted past Grieve to where Lydia Vale sat. She'd raised her head slightly, watching the game with an expression that wasn't quite fear, Wasn't quite resignation. It was something sharper, calculating. Like she was studying these men the way a naturalist studied insects. Their eyes met for half a second. In that fragment of connection, Rhett saw something he recognized. The look of someone who'd been knocked down so many times that getting up had become pure spite. He'd seen that look in his shaving mirror every morning for 3 years. Calder? You simple or just sleeping? Rhett blinked, focused back on Grieve. How much to call? $12. Grieve's smile widened. That's what you got left there, ain't it? Every last cent? It was. Rhett had come in with $18, most of what remained from selling his last decent horse. He'd already lost 6. $12 represented food for 2 weeks, lamp oil, ammunition. It represented the difference between making it to spring and not making it at all. He should fold. Any reasonable man would fold. But reason was for men who still had something to lose beyond their lives, and Rhett had long since stopped counting his life among his valuable possessions. Call. He pushed the coins forward. The watchers pressed closer. Someone whispered a bet to someone else. The bartender, a gap-toothed Irishman named Sullivan who owned the establishment, stopped wiping glasses to watch. Grieve laid down his cards with theatrical flair. 3 queens, just like he'd claimed. Read 'em and weep, Calder. That pot's mine, including... He jerked his thumb toward Lydia without looking at her. The bonus prize. Rhett stared at the queens. He'd seen worse beats. He'd survived worse nights. This was just one more loss in a long series of losses that defined his life, since the fever took Sarah and little Emma, since the ground froze too hard to dig proper graves, since... You gonna show your cards or just sit there looking tragic? Dutch called out, getting laughs. Rhett placed his cards face up. Pair of 8s, worthless against 3 queens. Grieve reached for the pot. Wait, Skinny Pete's voice cracked out. You didn't bet legal-like, Grieve. What? Grieve's hand stopped. She ain't yours to bet. Pete pointed a shaking finger at Lydia. You won her off crown, but you never took possession proper, never claimed her as property in front of witnesses with intent to wager. Means she ain't in the pot legal-like. Means you're a goddamn rules lawyer who ought to shut his mouth. Grieve stood fast enough to knock his chair back. His hand went to his belt where a Colt revolver sat like a promise. The room tensed. Violence had its own smell, copper and fear mixed together, and it was starting to fill the air. Pete's right, though. This voice came from an unexpected source, a grizzled freighter named Morrison who'd been drinking alone near the stove. I hauled freight for the territorial court last summer. Watched him hear a case just like this. If you didn't declare her as your stake before the hand got dealt, she ain't in the pot? That's law. This ain't a courtroom, old man. No, Morrison agreed, but we ain't animals, neither. We play straight. Otherwise, what's the point? A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. These were men who'd lie, cheat, and steal in 100 different ways. But the card table had its own honor. Break that, and you broke the only civilized thing left in this corner of the territory. Grieve's face went red, then purple. Fine. He grabbed Lydia's arm, hauling her to her feet. She stumbled but didn't cry out. This here's my property, one legal in the last hand. I stake her against... He looked at Rhett's empty spot where the coins had been. Against what? You got nothing left, Calder. Rhett stood slowly. His mind was moving in strange directions, down paths he didn't quite understand yet. I got my claim, 320 acres 10 miles north on Willow Creek. The room went silent. Land was real wealth, the only kind that mattered out here. 320 acres, even marginal acres, was worth 50 times what sat in that pot. You'd stake your land? Grieve's eyes narrowed with suspicion and interest mixed together. For a chance to win that pot back? New hand, Rhett said. Clean deal. Your woman, your claimed declared property, against my land deed. Winner takes all. You win, you get prime acreage and the pot. I win, I get the pot and her. Why? Lydia's voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear despite the rasp of exhaustion. She'd been silent so long that hearing her speak seemed almost supernatural. Why would you risk that? Rhett didn't have an answer he could explain. How could he tell her that driving back to that empty homestead tonight, to that hollow silence where his family used to be, felt like a death sentence? How could he explain that he needed something, anything, to change, even if that change was disaster? Does it matter? He asked instead. She studied him with those fierce, tired eyes. Then something shifted in her expression, a decision made. No, I suppose it doesn't. Grieve was already nodding, drunk on the idea of owning land. Deal the cards! Sullivan himself brought a fresh deck, sealed. He broke it open, shuffled with practiced hands, and placed it on the table. Cut for deal. They cut. Grieve won, grinning. 5-card draw, Sullivan announced, taking over the dealer role to keep it neutral. Nothing wild, straights and flushes count. Everyone good? Rhett and Grieve both nodded. The cards whispered across the felt. Rhett picked up his hand, fanning it slowly. King of spades, 10 of hearts, 7 of diamonds, 3 of clubs, 2 of clubs. Nothing. Not even a low pair. The worst hand he'd been dealt all night. Across from him, Grieve's face showed nothing but his eyes had that gleam, the hunter's gleam, when the deer steps into the clearing. How many cards? Sullivan asked. Grieve studied his hand. 2. Sullivan dealt him 2 replacements. Grieve picked them up, and his left eyebrow twitched. Just once, barely visible. But Rhett had played cards long enough to read that tell. Disappointment masked fast, but not fast enough. Calder? Rhett looked at his worthless hand. He could draw 4, keep the king. Draw 3, keep the king 10. The mathematics of it scrolled through his head. Odds, probabilities, chances, all of them bad. 4 cards. He dropped everything but the king. Sullivan dealt 4 fresh cards. The room held its breath. Rhett picked them up one at a time. King of hearts. A pair now. 9 of spades. 9s of clubs. 2 pair, kings and 9s. And finally, the last card. King of diamonds. Full house. Kings over 9s. His face didn't change. Couldn't change. But his heart, that cold, dead thing in his chest, suddenly remembered how to beat hard. Show, Sullivan said. Grieve laid down his cards with confidence that was almost convincing. 2 pair, aces and 8s. The dead man's hand. There was a superstition that Wild Bill Hickok had been holding that when he got shot in Deadwood. Men flinched at seeing it, but 2 pair didn't beat a full house. Rhett laid his cards down one at a time. King, king, king. 9, 9. The silence stretched so long it started to hurt. Then Grieve exploded. Bullshit! You drew 4 cards. Nobody makes a full house drawing 4 cards. You cheated. His hand went for his gun. 3 things happened simultaneously. Morrison's ancient Sharps rifle cocked with a sound like breaking bones. Sullivan produced a shotgun from under the bar. And Dutch, moving faster than a man his size should move, caught Grieve's wrist in a grip that stopped the draw cold. He won fair, Dutch said quietly. We all saw it. You want to die over a bad beat, that's your right. But you ain't taking him with you. Grieve struggled for a moment, then went still. The fury in his eyes promised this wasn't over, but for tonight, it was. Dutch released him. Grieve backed toward the door, pointing at Rhett. You'll regret this. That woman's poison, and that land won't be yours long. I promise you that. Then he was gone, the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle bottles behind the bar. The tension bled out of the room slowly. Men started talking again, drinking again, pretending they hadn't just witnessed something that might get people killed later. Rhett stood, collected the pot mechanically. The coins, the watch, the worthless claim deed. Then he walked to where Lydia Vale stood, still bound. Up close, he could see details the distance had hidden. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 25 or 26. The dirt on her face didn't quite hide a scattering of freckles across her nose. Her hands, despite the rope burns, had the long fingers of someone who'd done precision work, not just hard labor. You got a knife? She asked. Rhett pulled a folding knife from his pocket, opened it, and cut the ropes. They fell away, leaving red marks on her wrists that would become bruises by morning. She rubbed her wrist, studying him with that same calculating expression. You're either the biggest fool in Montana or you know something I don't. Probably the fool, Rhett admitted. What now? You own me? Is that how this works? Her voice carried a challenge, daring him to claim what the cards had given him. I don't own people. The words came out harder than he intended. You're free to go. Walk out that door, and I won't stop you. Go where? She gestured at the window where November darkness pressed against the glass. It's below freezing. I have no money, no supplies, no horse, and half the territory thinks I'm somebody's property. How far do you think I'd get? She had a point. A cruel point, but accurate. Then ride with me, Rhett said. My homestead's 10 miles north. It's not much, but it's shelter, food, a place to rest until you figure out your next move. No obligations, no expectations. He nearly choked on that last word, aware of how men in this territory treated women they considered possessions. Lydia searched his face, looking for the lie, the trap, the hidden price. Whatever she saw, or didn't see, made her decide. All right, Rhett Calder, I'll take that offer, but know this. She stepped closer, and despite the exhaustion, despite the dirt and the bruises and the obvious toll of whatever hell she'd been through, her spine was iron. I'm nobody's charity case. I work for my keep, and if you try to make me into something I'm not, you'll regret winning that hand. Deal, Rhett said. They shook on it, her grip surprisingly strong. Outside, Rhett's horse, a sturdy roan mare named Molly, waited at the hitching post, patient as stone. He untied her, then turned to Lydia. You can ride. I'll walk. We'll both ride, she said. I'm not so delicate I can't share a saddle, and you're not so proud you need to prove otherwise. He almost smiled, almost. Instead, he swung up first, then pulled her up behind him. She settled into position with the ease of someone familiar with horses, her hands light on his shoulders for balance. Where'd you learn to ride? He asked, nudging Molly into motion. That's a story for warmer nights and better circumstances. Fair enough. They rode in silence, leaving Bitterroot Junction behind. The settlement's scattered lights faded quickly in the darkness, leaving only starlight and the vague white outline of the trail. The cold bit deep. Rhett could feel Lydia shivering behind him, feel her trying to control it, trying not to show weakness. After a mile, he stopped, shrugged out of his heavy coat, and handed it back to her. I'm fine, she protested. You're freezing. Take it. You'll freeze. I've got more layers. Take the damn coat. She took it, wrapping it around herself. Thank you. They rode on. The mountains rose around them like sleeping giants, their peaks lost in clouds and darkness. Somewhere out there, wolves called to each other in voices that made the spaces between stars feel very large. Why'd you do it? Lydia's voice came quiet from behind him. Don't tell me you're a good man trying to rescue me. I've met good men. They don't gamble in saloons and they don't stake their land on cards. Rhett considered lying, considered deflecting, considered silence. But something about the night, about the strangeness of this whole situation, made him tell the truth. I buried my wife and daughter 3 years ago. Been trying to figure out how to live since. Mostly failing. Tonight, riding home to that empty house felt like... He paused, searching for words. Felt like the end of something. Needed something to change, even if that change was disaster. Is that what I am? Your disaster? Don't know yet. Ask me in a month. She made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something sadder. Fair enough. The homestead appeared gradually, first just a darker shadow against the dark hillside, then resolving into a cabin, a barn, a few outbuildings. Rhett had built it all himself, back when he'd believed in futures and plans. It sat in a small valley where Willow Creek ran cold and clear, surrounded by 320 acres of land that had broken his back and his heart in equal measure. He helped Lydia down, then tended to Molly, leading her into the barn and giving her feed and water. When he returned to the cabin, he found Lydia standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the lamp he'd lit inside. You live here alone? Yes. She stepped inside and he followed, seeing the place through her eyes, the sparse furniture, the neat but empty quality of rooms where no one really lived anymore, just existed. The fireplace cold, the table set for one, the photographs on the mantel of people who weren't coming back. I'll sleep in the barn, Lydia said, understanding without being told what those photographs meant. No. Rhett moved to the fireplace, began building a fire. You take the bed. I'll sleep out here. Rhett, it's not negotiable. He struck a match, and the kindling caught. And before you argue, understand this isn't chivalry. I haven't slept in that bed since... He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Then, all right, but tomorrow we talk. About what happens next. About what this arrangement really is. Tomorrow, Rhett agreed. She disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door softly. Rhett heard her moving around, heard the ropes of the bed creak as she lay down. He sat by the fire, watching the flames catch and grow. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Inside, for the first time in 3 years, the silence felt different. Not empty, just quiet. In the bedroom, Lydia Vale lay in a stranger's dead wife's bed, staring at a ceiling she couldn't see in the darkness. Her wrists ached, her body ached. But her mind was racing. She'd lied to Crown about who she was, lied to Grieve, would probably have to lie to Calder too, eventually. The truth was dangerous. The truth was, Lydia Vale wasn't running from debt or bad decisions. She was running from brilliance, from a university back east that had tolerated her until her theories got too radical, from colleagues who'd stolen her research, from a wealthy patron who'd offered funding with strings attached, strings that felt like chains, from a world that wanted to use her mind but couldn't accept that it came attached to a woman who refused to be quiet, decorative, or grateful. She'd fled west believing the frontier might care less about her gender and more about her abilities. What she'd found instead was a different kind of prison. Men like Crown, who saw a woman alone as property waiting to be claimed. But Rhett Calder, he was different. Broken, clearly. Dangerous in his own way, probably. But when he'd cut those ropes, when he'd offered freedom instead of ownership, she'd seen something rare. A man too destroyed to pretend anymore. She could work with that. Had to work with that. Because going back east meant becoming what they wanted her to be, silent and small and safely supervised. And Lydia Vale had played that role before. She was done playing. Tomorrow, she'd see this land Calder had gambled. See what 320 acres of Montana frontier could tell her. See if maybe, just maybe, she could turn this disaster into something like opportunity. For now, she let exhaustion pull her down into sleep. Her last thought, a strange one. The worst night of her life had somehow ended with hope. In the main room, Rhett added another log to the fire and pulled a blanket around himself. The floor was hard. The cold crept in around the windows, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't counting the hours until sunrise. He'd made a gamble tonight. A reckless, stupid gamble that went against every survival instinct he'd honed since losing Sarah and Emma. He'd staked his land, his only real asset, on cards and chance. And he'd won. Not money, not property, but something stranger, responsibility, purpose, the need to see this through, whatever this turned out to be. Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and indifferent. Inside, 2 broken people sheltered from the cold, both gambling that tomorrow might be different than yesterday. Neither knew it yet, but that single poker hand, that moment of reckless desperation, had set in motion forces that would reshape not just their lives, but the entire territory. The land baron who'd been watching, the community that would soon need them, the frontier itself, ready to be remade by those brave enough or foolish enough to try. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, the fire burned, the wind howled, and 2 strangers slept under the same roof, bound by nothing but chance and the shared understanding that sometimes the only way forward is to risk everything on a hand you know you shouldn't play. The cards had fallen, the bet was made, and there was no folding now. Dawn came reluctantly to the Montana Valley, painting the frost-covered hills in shades of gray and pale gold. Rhett woke with his back aching from the hard floor and his mind already cataloging the day's work. Fence repairs, checking the water line, splitting more firewood before the next storm hit. The same endless list that had defined every morning for 3 years. Then he heard movement from the bedroom and remembered nothing about today would be the same. Lydia emerged as he was stoking the fire back to life. Her hair pulled back in a practical braid, still wearing the same worn dress, but somehow looking more present, more solid than she had the night before. She'd washed her face and hands, the basin he kept in the bedroom showed evidence of that, and the dirt was gone, revealing features that were handsome rather than pretty, strong rather than delicate. Coffee? Rhett asked. Please. He moved to the stove, going through the familiar motions. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it carried weight, questions unasked, boundaries undefined. Your land, Lydia said finally, accepting the tin cup he handed her. I'd like to see it. All of it. Rhett studied her over his own coffee. It's not much to look at. 320 acres of stubborn soil and failed dreams. Then it should be a quick tour. She met his eyes with that same direct challenge he'd seen last night. Unless you're afraid I'll judge you for it. Lady, there's nothing you could think of me that I haven't already thought worse. Something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. Then let's go. They ate a quick breakfast of cornmeal mush and salt pork, then stepped out into the cold morning. The valley spread before them, caught in that strange between light where night hadn't quite surrendered today. Willow Creek cut through the eastern portion, its water running clear and cold over smooth stones. Beyond it, the land rolled in gentle waves toward the tree line where pines stood dark against the sky. Rhett led her to the fields first, 20 acres that he'd cleared by hand, pulling rocks and roots until his palms bled and his back screamed. He'd planted wheat the first year. Half of it died. The second year he'd tried corn. Worse results. Last year he'd barely bothered, scattering seed with the fatalistic hope of a man who no longer believed in harvests. Lydia walked between the furrows, her boots crunching on frost-hardened ground. She knelt suddenly, digging her fingers into the soil, bringing up a handful to examine. Her eyes narrowed in concentration. What are you doing? Rhett asked. Looking. She crumbled the soil between her fingers, sniffed it, even tasted a tiny amount before spitting it out. Your soil's not dead. It's exhausted. That's not better. It's completely different. She stood, brushing her hands on her dress. Dead soil can't be fixed. Exhausted soil just needs rest and the right approach. I've rested it. Rotated crops. Did everything the agricultural manuals said. Those manuals were written for Virginia and Ohio, not Montana. She walked further into the field, her gaze sweeping across the land with an intensity that made Rhett feel like he was watching someone read a book he couldn't see. You've been fighting the land, trying to force it to be something it's not. What if you worked with it instead? Meaning what? She turned to face him, and there was something fierce in her expression, the first real passion he'd seen from her. Meaning your approach has been all wrong. You're planting in straight rows, single crops, fighting for every inch like you're in a war. But land like this, marginal, high altitude, frost-prone, it doesn't respond to force. It responds to cooperation. You sound like you know what you're talking about. I do. The words came out flat, final. Then she seemed to catch herself, softening slightly. I studied agriculture, among other things. Before, She didn't finish, but Rhett heard the weight of whatever came after that before. He recognized it, the same weight he carried about his own past. What would you do different? He asked. Lydia's eyes lit up. Everything. Companion planting, crops that support each other instead of competing, legumes to fix nitrogen in the soil, cover crops in the off-season to prevent erosion and add organic matter, windbreaks to protect tender plants, maybe even some of the newer theories about beneficial insects, and she stopped abruptly, as if realizing she'd revealed too much. It would take time and work, and faith that I actually know what I'm talking about. Rhett looked at his fields, his failed, stubborn, heartbreaking fields. Then at this woman who'd appeared in his life through a poker hand and seemed to see possibilities where he saw only defeat. I staked this land on cards last night, he said slowly. Seems stupid to not gamble on it again. This isn't gambling, this is science. On the frontier, science is gambling. He held out his hand. But I'm willing to bet. Show me what you see. She took his hand, shook it firmly. Then let's start with a real survey. I need to see your water sources, understand your sun exposure, test the soil in different areas. Can you spare a day for that? I can spare whatever time this takes. They spent the morning walking every acre. Lydia produced a small notebook from somewhere, one of the few possessions she apparently had, and began making notes and rough sketches. She examined the creek, tested the soil in a dozen different spots, studied the tree line and the angle of the hills. Rhett watched her work with growing fascination. This wasn't the exhausted, beaten-down woman from last night. This was someone transformed by purpose, moving with the confidence of expertise that couldn't be faked. "Where did you really learn all this?" he asked during a break for water. Lydia hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Cornell University. I studied agricultural science and soil chemistry. Was working on my doctorate when—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "When I discovered that being brilliant wasn't enough if you were also female. They wanted my research, but not my voice. Wanted my ideas, but not my credit. So I left." "You ran away." "I refused to be erased." Fire flashed in her eyes. "There's a difference. I came west thinking maybe out here, where survival matters more than propriety, people would care more about results than gender. Instead, I found men like Crown who saw a woman traveling alone and decided I must be property waiting to be claimed." "How'd you end up with him?" "Desperation. I was in Bannock, running low on money, trying to find work. Crown offered transport to Helena, where he claimed there were teaching positions. Halfway there, he informed me I was actually collateral for a debt he owed. By then, we were too far from anywhere for me to run, and he had a gun." She said it matter-of-factly, but Rhett heard the fury underneath. "The rest you saw." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Sorry doesn't change anything. Action does." She turned back to the land. "This, though, this I can change. If you let me." "It's your land too now," Rhett said. "You're here. You're working it. That makes it as much yours as mine." She looked at him sharply. "I'm not asking for ownership. I'm asking for the chance to prove my theories work. And I'm saying you don't need to prove anything to have a claim here. You want to rebuild this land? Do it. You want to try something crazy? Try it. You want to burn the whole thing down and start over? Fine, just—" He struggled for words. "Just don't ask permission like you're still someone's property." Lydia stared at him for a long moment. Then quietly, "Thank you." They worked in companionable silence after that, Lydia making her notes while Rhett answered questions about wind patterns, frost dates, what had grown where in previous years. The sun climbed higher, burning off the frost and bringing a touch of warmth that wouldn't last past noon. Around midday, they heard hoofbeats. Rhett tensed automatically. Visitors were rare and usually brought problems. 3 riders appeared on the trail from town, moving at an easy pace that suggested they weren't in a hurry, but weren't friendly either. "Expecting company?" Lydia asked quietly. "No." The riders drew closer, resolving into faces Rhett recognized. Ned Fletcher, who owned the spread to the west, Tom Briggs, a rancher from 5 miles south, and riding between them, looking somehow smaller in daylight, but no less bitter, Marcus Grieve. They stopped at the edge of Rhett's property, making a point of the boundary. "Calder," Fletcher called out. He was a broad man with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too many winters to trust easily. "Heard you had an interesting night." "Word travels fast." "Always does when someone makes a fool's bet." Fletcher's gaze shifted to Lydia, assessing. "This her? The woman you won off Grieve?" "I won her off Crown," Rhett corrected. "Grieve just dealt the cards." "Details." Grieve spat the word like poison. "Point is, you made a bet that's causing problems." "What problems?" Briggs spoke up, a lean man with a face like weathered leather. "There's talk in town. Crown's claiming you stole his property, says that hand wasn't legal, that the woman's still his, that you owe him compensation. Crown lost her in a legal game to Grieve. Grieve staked her in a legal game with me. I won. That's the end of it." "Except it's not." Fletcher shifted in his saddle. "Crown's got friends, connected friends. They're making noise about theft, about disrupting legitimate business arrangements. Some folks are listening." Lydia stepped forward before Rhett could respond. "I'm not property. I was never legitimately Crown's, and I'm certainly not Calder's now. I'm a free woman working this land by choice." Grieve laughed, ugly and sharp. "You hear that, boys? She thinks she has choices. Lady, out here, you're whatever the men with guns say you are." "Then I guess I'll need a gun." Her voice stayed level, but steel ran through it. "Unless one of you wants to be the first to test whether I know how to use it." The 3 men exchanged glances. Fletcher looked almost amused. Briggs seemed uncomfortable. Grieve just looked angry. "This is going to cause you trouble, Calder," Fletcher said. "Crown's not going to let this go, and the people backing him, they don't lose gracefully." "Who's backing him?" Rhett asked. Fletcher's face went carefully neutral. "Can't say for certain, but there's rumors. Big money, the kind that doesn't like being told no." They rode off without another word, leaving Rhett and Lydia standing in the cold. When the hoofbeats faded, Lydia turned to Rhett. "Who do you think is really behind this?" "Only one man in the territory with enough money and mean spirit to care about one woman's status." Rhett's jaw tightened. "Victor Hale." The name hung in the air like smoke. Everyone in Montana Territory knew Victor Hale. Former railroad executive turned land baron, he'd built an empire through legal maneuvering, political connections, and a willingness to crush anyone who stood in his way. He owned half the businesses in Helena, controlled the territorial legislature through carefully placed bribes, and collected land claims the way some men collected stamps. "Why would someone like that care about me?" Lydia asked. "Maybe he doesn't. Maybe Crown owes him money and you're collateral. Or maybe—" Rhett studied her thoughtfully. "Maybe someone told him about your expertise, about what you know. A man like Hale's always looking for advantages, and agricultural innovation could be worth a fortune out here." Lydia's expression went cold. "I won't be used again. Not by Crown, not by Hale, not by anyone. Then we'd better make sure you don't give them the chance." They spent the afternoon fortifying the homestead, checking weapons, inventorying ammunition, discussing defensive positions if it came to that. But even as they prepared for potential violence, Lydia kept returning to her notebook, refining her plans for the land. "You really think you can make this work?" Rhett asked as the sun started its descent toward the mountains. "I know I can." She tapped her notebook. "The question is whether we have time before Hale or Crown or whoever else decides to make their move." "How long would you need?" "For full results? A growing season. Maybe 2. She looked up at him. "But for proof of concept, for something dramatic enough to make people pay attention, I could do it in weeks if we start now. Plant a winter crop using companion methods. Show growth where nothing grew before. It won't be a harvest, but it'll be undeniable evidence that the approach works." "It's November. Nothing grows in November." "Most things don't, but some do if you create the right conditions." Her eyes held that fierce light again. "Trust me." Rhett thought about trust. Thought about Sarah, who he'd trusted completely and who'd been taken anyway. Thought about the land, which he'd trusted to provide and which had given him nothing but heartbreak. Thought about cards and chance and the way a single hand could change everything. "What do you need?" Lydia's smile was small but genuine. "Seeds, tools, labor, and a willingness to look like fools until we prove we're not." "I've looked like worse." They started the next morning before dawn. Lydia directed while Rhett worked, preparing a half-acre plot near the creek where the soil was richest and the water access easiest. Instead of straight rows, they created curved beds that followed the land's natural contours. Instead of single crops, Lydia had Rhett plant in clusters, winter rye mixed with Austrian winter peas, turnips alongside radishes, each combination chosen for how the plants would support each other. "The peas fix nitrogen," she explained as they worked. "The rye protects them from frost. The turnips break up compacted soil while the radishes mark the rows. Everything serves multiple purposes. Everything supports everything else." Sounds complicated. "It's actually simpler than what you were doing. You were fighting the land's nature. This works with it." By the 3rd day, word had spread. Settlers started appearing at the property line, watching with undisguised curiosity. Nobody came close, but Rhett could feel their eyes, hear their whispered conversations. "They think we're crazy," he muttered. "Good. When we succeed, it'll mean more." Lydia didn't even look up from the seedbed she was preparing. On the 4th day, a wagon appeared. An older woman climbed down, weathered and sturdy, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She approached cautiously, stopping a respectful distance away. "Name's Martha Hendricks," she called out. "My husband and I farm 10 miles east. Heard about what you're doing." Rhett straightened, wary. "And I want to know if you're really as crazy as they say, or if there's something to it." Martha came closer, her eyes sharp with intelligence. "I've been farming 40 years. Watched my mother farm 40 years before that. We know the old ways work, mostly. But they're hard. If there's easier ways that work better, I want to know. Lydia stood, brushing soil from her hands. There are better ways. Not easier necessarily, but more effective. The methods I'm using come from scientific research, tested and proven. By who? Some fancy university back east? Yes, actually, Cornell University. I studied there for 4 years. Martha's eyebrows rose. A woman? A woman? Lydia lifted her chin, waiting for the judgment. Instead, Martha laughed, a rough, genuine sound. Well, I'll be damned. My husband always said women didn't have the brains for higher learning. I'll enjoy telling him he's wrong. She moved to examine the beds Lydia had created. Explain it to me. All of it. For the next hour, Lydia walked Martha through the theory and practice of companion planting, cover cropping, and soil regeneration. Martha listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that knowledge could mean survival, asking sharp questions that proved she knew her business. It makes sense, Martha said finally. Goes against everything we've been taught, but it makes sense. When will you know if it works? 2 weeks for germination, 4 to 6 for visible growth that proves the concept. I'll be back in 4 weeks then. And if this works, if it really works, you'll have more visitors than you can handle. Every farmer in the territory will want to know your secrets. Martha left, but her visit marked a turning point. Over the next week, more neighbors came. Some mocked. Some watched with cynical eyes. But some, the ones desperate enough or smart enough to see possibility, started asking questions. Rhett found himself in the strange position of defending something he didn't fully understand to men he barely knew. But he did it anyway, because watching Lydia work, seeing her passion and expertise transform his dead fields into something alive had rekindled something he'd thought was gone forever. Hope. 2 weeks after they planted, the first green shoots appeared. Rhett saw them at dawn, tiny spears of life pushing through the soil that had given him nothing but failure. He stood there, coffee growing cold in his hand, staring at the impossible made real. Told you, Lydia said from behind him. She'd come to stand beside him, her own coffee steaming in the cold air. The land's not dead. It just needed someone to listen to what it was trying to say. How did you know? Science, observation, and maybe a little bit of faith that the world makes sense if you pay attention to it. The green shoots spread over the following days, growing faster than seemed natural. The winter rye came up thick and strong, protecting the more delicate pea plants that twined through it. The turnips and radishes marked perfect rows, their leaves already showing healthy growth. Visitors increased. Some came skeptical and left believers. Others came looking for ways to discredit what they were seeing, but the evidence was literally growing in front of them. Then, 3 weeks after they'd planted, Victor Hale came to call. He arrived in a carriage, an actual carriage, polished black with brass fittings that caught the weak winter sun. 2 men on horseback flanked it, hard-eyed men with guns worn easy on their hips. The carriage stopped at the property line, and a man stepped out. Victor Hale was smaller than his reputation suggested, maybe 5'8", with a slim build that his expensive clothes couldn't quite hide. But his eyes were chips of gray ice, and the way he moved, precise, controlled, calculating, suggested a predator that killed with patience rather than force. "Mr. Calder," he called out, his voice cultured and Eastern. "I hope I'm not intruding." Rhett set down the post he'd been splitting and walked to meet him, deliberately not inviting him closer. "Hale, I've heard interesting things about your property. Thought I'd see for myself." Hale's gaze swept over the fields, lingering on the green shoots. "Remarkable. Growth in November. Most unusual. We've had some success." "So it seems." Hale's attention shifted to Lydia, who'd emerged from the barn. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened with interest. "And you must be the woman everyone's talking about, the one Calder won in a card game." "I'm Lydia Vale, and I wasn't won. I was freed." "Semantics, Miss Vale. Or is it Mrs. Calder now?" "It's Miss Vale." "I see." Hale smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're responsible for this agricultural miracle, I'm told." "I'm responsible for applying established scientific principles to receptive soil." "How modest. Tell me, Miss Vale, where did you acquire such expertise?" Lydia hesitated, and in that hesitation, Rhett saw her recognize the trap. Hale already knew the answer. He'd come here knowing exactly who she was. Cornell University, she said finally. Indeed, how fascinating. I'm acquainted with some of the faculty there. Professor Whitmore, for instance. I believe he's doing groundbreaking work in soil chemistry. Perhaps you studied with him. I did. Splendid. I shall have to write him. Tell him one of his students is applying his theories to great effect in Montana territory. Hale's smile widened fractionally. I'm sure he'd be very interested to know where you ended up after you disappeared so mysteriously. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Rhett stepped forward. What do you want, Hale? Want? Why, nothing more than what any reasonable businessman wants. Opportunity. Hale gestured at the fields. You've demonstrated something valuable here. Methods that could transform agriculture across the territory. That has considerable commercial potential. Not for sale? I haven't made an offer yet. Doesn't matter. Not for sale. Hale's expression cooled by several degrees. You're being short-sighted, Mr. Calder. The knowledge Miss Vale possesses could be worth a fortune in the right hands. My hands, specifically. I have the resources to test these methods at scale, the connections to disseminate them widely, the capital to take credit for someone else's work, Lydia cut in, to patent and profit from research that isn't yours. Thank you, but I've seen how that story ends. Have you? Hale's voice went soft, dangerous. Because the way I see it, you're a woman of questionable legal status working land you have no claim to, using methods that rightfully belong to the institutions that trained you. You're vulnerable, Miss Vale. Remarkably so. Whereas if you were to work with me, under proper supervision, of course, you'd have protection, resources, legitimacy. And what? Rhett asked. She'd just be your property instead of Crown's? I prefer the term valued employee. But if crude language makes you more comfortable, yes, she would be mine in ways that would actually be legally recognized and protected. Unlike her current situation, which is, Hale smiled again, precarious. Get off my land. Your land, for now. Hale climbed back into his carriage. But ownership is such a fragile thing, Mr. Calder. Property taxes come due. Mortgages get called in. Legal challenges arise. I do hope you're prepared for all eventualities. The carriage rolled away, leaving Rhett and Lydia standing in the cold. When the sound of wheels faded, Lydia spoke quietly. He won't stop. Men like that never do. I know. He'll find ways to pressure us. Legal challenges, economic manipulation, maybe even violence. I know. She turned to face him. Then why are you still willing to fight him? This isn't your battle. You could walk away right now, tell me to leave, save yourself the trouble. Rhett looked at the fields, at the green shoots that proved impossibility could become real. Looked at this woman who'd appeared in his life through chance and chaos and had somehow reminded him what it felt like to want something beyond mere survival. 3 years ago, I buried my family and stopped believing the world could be anything but cruel. Then you showed up and started growing things in dead soil. Maybe I can't walk away from that. Maybe I don't want to. Lydia held his gaze, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that they were both gambling again, both risking everything on the chance that broken things could be rebuilt. Then we'd better be ready, she said, because Hale's right about one thing. This fight is going to get worse before it gets better. That night, as frost settled over the valley and the fire burned low, Rhett and Lydia sat at his table planning their defense, not with guns, though those would be ready if needed, but with strategy. They would document everything, establish witnesses to Lydia's expertise and their methods. They would build allies among the settlers who were already starting to believe. They would make themselves too visible, too legitimate, too valuable to the community for Hale to easily destroy. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble against a man with unlimited resources and no conscience. But then again, so was planting crops in November. So was winning a woman's freedom in a poker hand. So was believing that two broken people could build something worth defending. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the promise of winter storms. Inside, two people who'd both fled impossible situations planned their stand against the inevitable. The land would test them. Hale would come for them. The frontier itself would try to break them, like it broke everyone eventually. But for now, at least, they had each other. They had a plan. They had green shoots growing where nothing should grow. And sometimes in the hard country, that was enough to keep fighting. The first blow came exactly 1 week after Hale's visit, delivered not with violence, but with paper and ink. A rider appeared at dawn carrying an official-looking envelope sealed with the territorial government's stamp. Rhett opened it at the kitchen table while Lydia made coffee, both of them knowing before he broke the seal that whatever was inside meant trouble. "Property tax assessment," Rhett said, his voice flat as he scanned the document. "Says I owe $470 in back taxes. Due immediately." Lydia set down her coffee cup hard enough to slosh liquid onto the table. "That's impossible. What's the assessment based on?" "Says here the land's been reevaluated based on recent improvements and demonstrated agricultural productivity. Signed by the territorial tax assessor." He turned the paper so she could see. Dated 3 days ago. "Hale." She didn't make it a question. "Has to be. He owns half the territorial government." Rhett did quick calculations in his head, knowing the answer before he finished. "I've got maybe $90 total. You?" "Nothing. Everything I owned was taken by Crown." Her hands clenched into fists. "So what happens if you can't pay?" "Land goes to auction to satisfy the debt. Guess who'll be the only bidder with that kind of cash?" They sat in silence, the magnitude of it settling over them like snow. $470 might as well be $4,000. It was money neither of them had, money they couldn't raise in time, money specifically calculated to be just beyond reach. "There has to be a way to fight this," Lydia said. "Challenge the assessment, demand an appeal, something." "Sure. Through territorial courts that Hale controls. That'll take months we don't have, and cost money for lawyers we definitely don't have." Rhett stood, paced to the window. Outside, frost glittered on the fields where green shoots continued their impossible growth. "He's got us, clean and simple." "No." Lydia's voice cut through his resignation like steel. "No, he doesn't, not yet. You got $400 hidden somewhere I don't know about?" "I've got something better. I've got proof that this land is valuable, that the methods we're using work. If Hale wants it that badly, it means others will too." She grabbed her coat. "We need witnesses. Documentation. We need to make our success so public, so undeniable, that people will invest in protecting it. Invest how? However they can. Money, labor, political pressure. Martha Hendricks believed in what we're doing. Maybe she knows others who will too. We've got 2 weeks before that tax bill comes due. 2 weeks to turn this homestead into something the community needs badly enough to defend." It was desperate logic, the kind of plan that only made sense when all the reasonable options were gone. But Rhett had gambled on worse odds. He grabbed his own coat. "Then we'd better get started." They rode to Martha Hendricks' place first, finding the older woman in her barn tending to a milk cow. She listened to their situation with a face that revealed nothing, then nodded slowly. "I'll be honest with you, most folks won't stick their necks out against Victor Hale. He's got too much power, too many ways to make life difficult." She paused, studying them both. "But there's maybe 15-20 farming families in this area who are barely hanging on. Bad harvests, exhausted soil, watching their children go hungry while the land gives them nothing. If you can prove your methods work, really prove it, not just with one little test plot, some of them might take the risk." "What would convince them?" Lydia asked. "Show them something they can't ignore. Those green shoots you've got are impressive, but they're small. You want to rally support, you need dramatic results. Something that makes people believe their own farms could be saved." "We need more land," Lydia said, thinking aloud. "Multiple test sites, different soil conditions, enough scope to prove the methods scale beyond a single plot." "Use mine." Martha's words came quick and decisive. "I've got 40 acres of played-out soil that hasn't produced a decent crop in 3 years. You make that land grow again, I'll tell every farmer in the territory, and I'll back you when Hale comes calling." Rhett looked at Lydia, saw the fierce hope in her eyes, the possibility taking shape. "We'd need supplies, seeds, tools, labor to prepare that much ground." "I've got tools. As for labor," Martha smiled grimly, "my husband died 2 years back. My sons work in the mines in Butte, but I'm not dead yet, and I can still swing a hoe. Plus, if we let it be known what we're doing, I expect some of the desperate ones will show up. Folks who've got nothing left to lose are the most likely to take chances." She was right. Word spread through the farming community like fire through dry grass, and by the next morning, 5 families had shown up at Martha's property, ready to work. They came with doubt etched into their weathered faces, with skepticism born from too many failed seasons, but they came. Because the alternative was watching their children starve while their land turned to dust. Rhett organized the labor while Lydia directed the planting. She moved between work crews like a general commanding an army, explaining companion planting to grizzled farmers who'd never heard the term but understood instinctively when she showed them how the plants would support each other. She taught them about nitrogen-fixing legumes, about cover crops that would prevent erosion while adding organic matter, about creating microclimates that would protect tender plants from the harsh Montana weather. Some listened with open minds. Others muttered that book learning from fancy universities didn't mean spit on actual frontier land. But they all worked, because Martha Hendricks had thrown her weight behind this effort, and Martha was respected. The work was brutal. They had 10 days left before the tax bill came due, and 40 acres to prepare and plant. Rhett pushed himself until his muscles screamed and his hands bled through the calluses. Lydia worked beside him, refusing to quit even when exhaustion made her stumble, even when the cold turned her fingers white and numb. On the 3rd day, more families arrived. Then more. Word had spread that something unusual was happening at the Hendricks place, and curiosity drew people who might otherwise have stayed away. Some came to mock, some came to see failure, but some, the ones who were desperate enough or smart enough, came to learn. Lydia found herself teaching impromptu classes in the evenings, farmers crowding into Martha's kitchen to hear her explain soil chemistry and companion planting principles. She drew diagrams on slate boards, showed them the notebooks where she'd documented their initial success, answered questions that ranged from genuinely curious to openly hostile. "This is all well and good in theory," one grizzled farmer named Jensen challenged. "But winter's coming hard. Even if your crops germinate, they'll freeze and die before they produce anything worth harvesting." "Some will," Lydia agreed. "That's the nature of frontier farming. But the winter hardy varieties I've chosen, Austrian winter peas, winter rye, certain brassicas, they're built to survive cold, and the companion planting creates mutual protection. The taller plants shelter the shorter ones. The ground cover insulates the soil. It's a system designed to be resilient, not fragile." Designed by who? Cornell professors who've never seen a Montana winter? Designed by observation and testing across hundreds of climates. And yes, including Montana, the data exists if you're willing to look at it. Jensen snorted but didn't leave. None of them left. Because despite their skepticism, despite their fear of looking foolish or backing the wrong horse, they could see those green shoots in Rhett's field continuing to thrive. They could see possibility taking root. On the 5th day, Victor Hale's men appeared. They rode up to where Rhett was working a section near the creek, 4 hard-faced men on expensive horses. The leader was a bull-necked enforcer named Cutter, who handled Hale's dirty work with professional efficiency. "Mr. Hale wants you to know he's noticed your recent activities," Cutter said, his voice carrying the bored tone of a man delivering a message he'd delivered 100 times before. "All this planting, all this organizing, it's not going to change the fact that you owe money you can't pay." Rhett kept working, not giving them the satisfaction of stopping. "That's between me and the tax office." "Is it? Because it looks to us like you're trying to create some kind of community resistance, getting folks worked up, making promises you can't keep. Mr. Hale finds that concerning." "I'm not making promises. I'm planting crops. On someone else's land, using methods you're teaching to other people. Spreading ideas that might make folks think they can stand up to their betters." Cutter leaned forward in his saddle. "See, that's the problem. You're not just failing on your own anymore. You're taking other people down with you." Lydia emerged from the tree line carrying an armload of stakes for marking rows. She stopped when she saw Hale's men, her expression going carefully neutral. "Miss Vale." Cutter touched his hat in mock courtesy. "Mr. Hale asked me to extend a reminder of his generous offer. Work for him directly, share your expertise under proper supervision, and all this unpleasantness goes away. You'd be compensated fairly, housed comfortably, given resources to do real research instead of playing in the dirt with desperate farmers." "Tell Mr. Hale I'd rather play in the dirt." Cutter's smile went cold. That's unfortunate, because when Calder's land goes to auction, and it will, you'll find yourself without shelter or protection. A woman alone in this territory doesn't fare well, as you've already learned. Crown's not the only man who'd be happy to claim you. She's not alone. Rhett straightened, meeting Cutter's eyes. And she's not property to be claimed. Strong words. Let's see if they hold up when winter hits and you're both homeless. Cutter gathered his reins. Mr. Hale's a patient man, but his patience has limits. You've got 9 days before that tax bill comes due. Use them wisely. They rode off, leaving a wake of unspoken threats. When they were gone, Lydia set down her load of steaks and looked at Rhett. He's right about one thing. When the auction happens, I'll have nowhere to go. Then we make sure the auction doesn't happen. How? We're no closer to having that money than we were 5 days ago. Rhett looked across the fields where dozens of people were working, transforming Martha's dead land into something that might live. Maybe we don't need the money. Maybe we need something else. That night, Martha called a meeting in her barn. 37 people showed up. Farmers, their wives, a few shopkeepers from town who'd heard about the project. They crowded into the space, breath steaming in the cold, waiting to hear what this was really about. Martha didn't waste time on speeches. Most of you know Rhett Calder's got a tax bill he can't pay. Bill's designed to force him off his land so Victor Hale can claim it cheap. What you might not know is why Hale wants that land so bad. She gestured to Lydia, who stepped forward. For a moment, Lydia looked like what she was, a woman who'd fled violence and degradation, who carried the weight of displacement and exploitation. Then she lifted her chin and became something else, an expert who knew her worth. Hale wants my knowledge, she said clearly. The agricultural methods I've been teaching aren't mine alone. They're based on scientific research from Cornell University and field testing across multiple climates. But I'm one of the few people who understands how to adapt them to frontier conditions. Hale sees commercial potential. He wants to control that knowledge, patent it, sell it back to you at prices you can't afford. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone called out, "So what? Man's got a right to make money." He does, Lydia agreed. But these methods, this knowledge, it belongs to everyone who needs it. I didn't come west to make someone rich. I came because I was tired of my work being stolen and my voice being silenced. I won't let Hale do the same thing Crown tried to do, just with better lawyers. Pretty speech, Jensen said from the back, but it doesn't change the fact that Calder owes money. Law's the law. Is it? Martha's voice cracked like a whip. Law that gets changed whenever Hale needs it changed? Assessment that jumps 500% in 1 year? That's not law. That's robbery with paperwork. So what do you propose we do about it? We fight it. The voice came from an unexpected source, a quiet farmer named William Chen who'd been working the edge plots. He stepped forward, his English careful but clear. My family came from China. We know what it means when powerful men use law as weapon. You fight back by making them afraid to use it. Afraid how? Someone asked. By making it cost more than it's worth. By standing together. Chen looked around the barn. Alone, Calder loses his land and we lose access to knowledge that might save our farms. Together, we make noise. We make Hale's tactics public. We make territorial government explain why they're helping rich man steal from poor farmer. We make it political problem instead of quiet theft. The idea took hold slowly, passing through the crowd in whispers and thoughtful looks. These were people who'd learned to keep their heads down, to not challenge power, to accept that men like Hale always won. But they were also people who'd come west looking for something better, who'd gambled everything on the promise of land and freedom. What exactly are you suggesting? Rhett asked Chen. Petition. We document everything, the tax assessment, Hale's threats, the success of Miss Vale's methods. We send it to the territorial governor, to newspapers in Helena and Butte, to anyone who'll listen. We make this visible. Men like Hale operate in shadows. We drag it into light. The governor's in Hale's pocket, someone objected. Maybe, but newspapers aren't, not all of them. And elections are coming. Politicians don't like looking like they're helping rich men crush small farmers. Bad for votes. Martha nodded slowly. It's a long shot. But then, everything about this has been a long shot. They voted. Not everyone supported the plan. Some were too afraid of Hale's retaliation, too convinced that fighting was futile. But 23 families pledged their support, their signatures, their willingness to stand together. The petition was drafted that night, written in Chen's careful hand with input from anyone who could read and write. It laid out the facts in plain language. The suspicious timing of the tax assessment, Hale's documented threats, the potential value of Lydia's agricultural expertise to the broader community. It named names, cited specific incidents, made the case that this was about more than one man's property dispute. It was about whether the territory would protect innovation and cooperation or let wealth and power crush both. 3 copies were made. 1 was sent to the territorial governor. 1 went to the Helena Independent, a newspaper known for sometimes challenging the establishment. The 3rd went to a lawyer in Butte who'd made his name defending miners against company abuses. "Now we wait," Martha said after the riders left carrying the petitions, "and we pray this works." But Rhett and Lydia didn't just wait. They worked. With 6 days left before the tax deadline, they pushed harder, expanding the plantings, documenting everything with photographs that Lydia purchased using the last of Martha's spare cash. They needed undeniable evidence of success, the kind of proof that would make their case impossible to dismiss. The crops responded as if they understood the urgency. The winter rye grew thick and green, the peas twined upward with startling vigor. The brassicas developed leaves that spoke of health and vitality. It shouldn't have worked this well this fast, but Lydia's careful planning, the companion planting, the microclimate creation, the soil preparation, created conditions where plants thrived instead of merely survived. Visitors increased. Word had spread beyond the immediate farming community, and people came from as far as 50 miles to see the November crops growing where everyone knew nothing should grow. Some were believers, some were skeptics, but all of them saw the same thing: impossible made real. On the 4th day before the deadline, the Helena Independent published their story. A writer brought the newspaper at dawn, and Rhett read it aloud to Lydia and Martha over breakfast. The headline read, "Agricultural Innovation or Land Grab? Frontier Farmer Faces Suspicious Tax Assessment." The article was fair but pointed. It laid out both sides: Hale's legal right to pursue the debt, Calder's claims of manipulation. But the reporter had done something crucial. He'd visited the fields. He'd seen the crops. He'd talked to farmers who'd never successfully grown winter crops and were now watching green shoots emerge on their own land using Lydia's methods. "This is bigger than a property dispute," the article concluded. "This is about whether Montana Territory will support innovation and community cooperation, or whether wealth and political connections will be allowed to crush both. The outcome of Mr. Calder's case may well determine the answer." "It's not enough," Lydia said, though her eyes showed hope. "One article won't stop Hale." "No," Martha agreed, "but it makes him visible, and men like Hale hate visibility." They found out how much Hale hated it the next day when 3 more riders appeared, not Cutter and his thugs this time, but lawyers carrying papers. The lead attorney was a thin man named Parsons with spectacles and a briefcase. He approached Rhett with the expression of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. "Mr. Calder, I represent Mr. Victor Hale. I'm here to inform you that Mr. Hale is prepared to make a final offer regarding your property and associated interests." He glanced at Lydia. "He's willing to forgive the entire tax debt in exchange for a formal contract transferring all rights to Miss Vale's agricultural methods and research, along with her agreement to work exclusively for Hale Enterprises for a period of 5 years. "No," Lydia said, before Rhett could respond. Parsons adjusted his spectacles. "Perhaps you should consider the terms before—" "I said no. I won't sell my knowledge to a man who wants to use it as a weapon against the people who need it most. Miss Vale, you're not in a position to negotiate. Mr. Hale holds all the leverage here." "Does he?" Martha stepped forward, holding up the newspaper. "Because it seems to me leverage goes both ways. Your employer's facing some uncomfortable questions right now. Questions about using government office for personal gain, about crushing small farmers to build his empire. How much worse will those questions get if he follows through?" Parsons' expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Calculation. Reassessment. "Mr. Hale is prepared to weather public scrutiny. The law is on his side." "Then let him use it," Rhett said. Let him take this to auction, seize the land publicly, explain to everyone why crushing one farmer and stealing a woman's work serves justice. Let's see how that plays in the newspapers. The lawyer studied them for a long moment. Then he packed up his papers with precise movements. Very well. The auction is scheduled for 3 days from now, 10 o'clock, at the Territorial Land Office in Bitterroot Junction. I suggest you prepare for the consequences of your decision. After he left, the three of them stood in silence. They'd just burned their last bridge, refused their last way out. In 3 days, everything would be over one way or another. We need a miracle, Martha said quietly. We need a plan, Lydia corrected. Rhett, how many people showed up to help with the planting? 37 at the peak. Get word to all of them. Tell them to come to the auction. Bring families, bring anyone they can. We're going to make this the most public land seizure this territory has ever seen. What good will that do? Rhett asked. Maybe none. But if we're going down loud. We're going to make Hale work for this. Make him show his whole hand in front of witnesses. Her eyes held that fierce determination that had first caught Rhett's attention in the saloon. And maybe, just maybe, someone with power will decide they can't let it happen. It was desperate logic again, the kind of plan that relied on hope and shame and the slim chance that public pressure could overcome private power. But it was all they had. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Riders went out carrying messages. Farmers who'd pledged support confirmed they'd attend. Chen suggested they bring the crops themselves, dig up samples, roots and all, to show physical proof of success. It was dramatic, possibly pointless, but they did it anyway. The night before the auction, Rhett sat with Lydia on the porch of his cabin, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. The fields stretched before them, green even in November, proof that impossible things could happen if you were willing to bet everything. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For what? For dragging you into this. If I just let you walk away that first night, I'd be what? Dead in a ditch? Crown's property? Working for Hale under conditions I'd have no power to refuse? She shook her head. You gave me the first real choice I'd had in months. Whatever happens tomorrow, I made that choice. We both did. We could still run, take Molly and just go. Head for California or Oregon or somewhere Hale's reach doesn't extend. We could, she agreed. But then what? We'd still be running, still be letting men like him win, still be proving that power crushes everything good and innovative and cooperative. She turned to look at him. I'm tired of running, Rhett. Tired of being smaller than I am just to stay safe. Tomorrow, we stand. Win or lose, we stand. Rhett thought about Sarah and Emma, about how losing them had hollowed him out and left him going through motions instead of living. He thought about the gamble he'd made in that saloon, the reckless bet that had brought this impossible woman into his life. He thought about green shoots in November and farmers learning to hope again, and the strange, fragile thing he and Lydia had built in the space between disaster and possibility. Then we stand, he said. They sat together as darkness fell, neither speaking, both knowing that tomorrow would change everything. The wind carried the smell of growing things, of soil coming back to life, of a future that might exist or might be crushed before it could begin. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Outside, the November cold settled over the valley like a held breath. And two people who'd both learned that survival meant constant compromise prepared to stop compromising, to plant their feet and declare that some things, some fragile, impossible, desperately important things, were worth defending regardless of the cost. The morning would bring judgment, would bring Hale's power against their determination, would bring the question that had haunted them both since that night in the saloon. Was gambling on hope more foolish than accepting defeat? They'd find out soon enough. For now, they sat together in the gathering dark. Two people who'd been broken by the world and who'd somehow found in each other the courage to try staying whole. The Territorial Land Office in Bitterroot Junction was a squat building that had never been designed to hold more than a dozen people. By 9:30, the morning of the auction, nearly 80 souls crowded inside and spilled onto the street, their breath steaming in the November cold. They came on foot, on horseback, in wagons carrying children and elderly parents, who'd insisted on witnessing what everyone now understood was more than a simple property sale. Rhett arrived with Lydia and Martha just after 9. They'd brought the crop samples like Chen suggested, Winter rye and pea plants dug carefully with root systems intact, arranged in wooden crates that made the impossible visible. Green life, thriving in November, carried through town like evidence at a trial. People stared. Some reached out to touch the plants as if checking whether they were real. A woman Rhett didn't recognize whispered to her husband, "If they can make dead land grow, maybe there's hope for ours." That whisper, that fragile, desperate hope, was exactly what Hale wanted to crush, and he'd come prepared to do it. Victor Hale stood near the front of the room in a suit that probably cost more than most of these farmers earned in a year. Beside him stood Parsons, the lawyer, and Cutter, with two other enforcers positioned strategically near the exits. The message was clear. Hale controlled this space and everything that happened in it. The territorial assessor, a nervous man named Whitfield, sat behind a scarred desk shuffling papers with shaking hands. He'd been a reasonable official once, people said, before Hale's money taught him that reason was expensive and compliance was profitable. At precisely 10 o'clock, Whitfield stood and cleared his throat. The room fell silent. This hearing is called to address the matter of delinquent property taxes owed by Mr. Rhett Calder on 320 acres in Willow Creek Valley. The assessed amount is $470, due immediately. Mr. Calder, are you prepared to satisfy this debt? Rhett stood, aware of every eye on him. I'm prepared to challenge the assessment as fraudulent. The land was valued at $80 last year. Nothing's changed except Victor Hale decided he wants it. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Whitfield's face reddened. The assessment was conducted according to proper procedures, accounting for demonstrated improvements and productivity. Demonstrated by who? Lydia's voice cut through clear and sharp. I'm the one who implemented those improvements. Did your assessor consult with me? Did he examine the methods used, understand the science behind them, evaluate the actual productivity versus potential productivity? The assessment is based on market value, Parsons interjected smoothly, which has increased due to successful cultivation. Surely you're not arguing your own success should be penalized. I'm arguing that success achieved through my knowledge and labor doesn't automatically transfer value to land I don't own. The methods I'm using could be applied anywhere. The land itself hasn't fundamentally changed. Then you admit the value lies in your expertise. Parsons smiled thinly. Which brings us back to Mr. Hale's generous offer. Transfer the rights to your methods, agree to work under proper supervision, and the debt disappears. Transfer to you, you mean? So Hale can patent what should belong to everyone who needs it. Intellectual property has value, Miss Vale. Surely Cornell University taught you that. The mention of Cornell was deliberate, a reminder that Hale knew her history, could make her past a weapon if needed. But Lydia didn't flinch. Cornell taught me that knowledge hoarded is knowledge wasted, that science serves humanity, not profit margins. She turned to address the room. Everything I know, I'll teach freely to anyone willing to learn. You don't need Hale's permission or his patents. You need soil, seeds, and the willingness to try something different. Noble words, Hale spoke for the first time, his voice carrying effortless authority. But impractical. Agricultural innovation requires capital for research, resources for testing, infrastructure for distribution. Individual farmers can't provide that. I can. Under my direction, Miss Vale's methods could transform the entire territory. Under her current arrangement, they'll reach maybe a few dozen desperate families before she's... He paused delicately. Before circumstances change. The threat hung in the air, barely veiled. Before she's gone, he meant. Before something happens to her. Martha stood abruptly. You threatening her? In front of all these witnesses? I'm stating facts, Mrs. Hendricks. Miss Vale has no legal standing, no protection, no resources. She exists at the mercy of circumstance and the charity of others. That's not a position that encourages long-term planning. She's got us, Chen called out from the back. All of us. That's protection. Is it? Hale's gaze swept the crowd with calculated dismissal. Your farmer's barely surviving season to season. What protection can you offer against legal challenges, economic pressure, or simple accidents that befall people who refuse reasonable offers? That sounds like a threat too, someone shouted. It sounds like reality. Hale turned back to Whitfield. Shall we proceed with the actual business? The debt exists. It hasn't been paid. The law is clear. Whitfield looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, but he nodded. Mr. Calder, without payment in full, I'm required to seize the property and put it to auction. Do you have any response? Rhett pulled a folded document from his coat. I have this. A petition signed by 53 citizens of Montana Territory challenging this assessment as fraudulent and politically motivated. We're requesting a formal review by... A petition has no legal standing in a tax matter, Parsons interrupted. You're wasting time. Maybe. But those 53 signatures represent voters. Families. People who will remember come election time how their territorial government helped a rich man crush a small farmer. Rhett let the paper unfold. And we sent copies to every newspaper between here and Helena. The Helena Independent already ran one story. How many more do you want before this becomes a problem you can't manage? For the first time, Hale's expression showed something other than smug control, a flash of irritation quickly suppressed. You think publicity will save you? Public opinion is fickle. Law is permanent. Then let's test that. Lydia stepped forward, addressing Whitfield directly. I'm willing to submit to a formal evaluation of the land's actual productivity versus assessed value. Bring in independent agricultural experts, conduct soil tests, measure actual yield potential. If the assessment is accurate, we'll accept it. If it's fraudulent, it gets thrown out. That would take weeks, Parsons objected. The debt is due now. Convenient timing, isn't it? Martha's voice dripped contempt. Assessment happens fast when Hale wants it fast, but fair evaluation takes too long. That's not law, that's corruption with paperwork. Whitfield opened his mouth, closed it, looked desperately at Hale for guidance. The land baron's face had gone cold, calculating. He was losing control of the narrative, and men like Hale didn't lose gracefully. Enough! Hale's voice cut through the rising arguments. Mr. Whitfield, proceed with the auction. These delays are transparent stalling tactics. The law is clear, the debt is real, and I'm prepared to settle this matter immediately. Yes, sir. Whitfield caught himself, aware of how that sounded. In accordance with territorial statute, I hereby declare the property of Rhett Calder seized for non-payment of taxes and open for auction. Opening bid is set at the debt amount, $470. Do I hear? $500. Hale didn't hesitate. The crowd went silent. That was it then. No one else in the room had that kind of money. The charade of an auction would last maybe 30 seconds before Hale owned everything. $500, Whitfield repeated, his voice hollow. Going once? I'd like to make a counteroffer. The new voice came from the doorway, where a man had just entered. He was tall, perhaps 50, with the kind of weathered competence that spoke of years handling difficult situations. He wore a marshal's badge on his coat. And you are? Hale's tone suggested he already knew and wasn't pleased. U.S. Marshal Thomas Brennan, out of Fort Benton. I'm here investigating reports of fraudulent land assessments and illegal property seizures across the territory. He moved into the room, and people parted to let him through. This seems like a fortuitous time to arrive. Hale's expression didn't change, but Rhett saw his hands tighten imperceptibly. Marshal, this is a routine tax matter, hardly worth federal attention. Routine? Brennan pulled out his own papers. I've got documented evidence of 17 similar cases in the past 6 months. Small landholders suddenly hit with massive tax increases, all failing to pay, all properties ending up owned by the same buyer. That's not routine. That's a pattern. Successful business practices aren't illegal. They are when they involve falsified assessments, bribed officials, and forged documents. Brennan laid several papers on Whitfield's desk. These are the original tax assessment records for Calder's property, the real ones, obtained from the territorial archives before they could be altered. The land was valued at $78. Someone changed it to $470 and backdated the paperwork. Whitfield went pale. I received the assessment from the territorial office. You assumed what you were paid to assume. Brennan's gaze was steel. I've got affidavits from 3 other assessors who were pressured to inflate values on properties Hale wanted. One of them finally got a conscience and came forward. Once he started talking, others followed. The room erupted. Farmers who'd watched their neighbors lose land suddenly understood it wasn't bad luck or failed harvests. It was systematic theft dressed up as legal process. Hale remained calm, but Rhett could see the calculation behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of damage and options. Marshal, I'm certain there's been some misunderstanding. My business dealings are conducted entirely within legal bounds. If there have been irregularities, they occurred without my knowledge or consent. That's what they all say. Brennan turned to the crowd. I'm here to inform you that this auction is suspended pending a full federal investigation into property tax fraud. Mr. Calder's debt is nullified until accurate assessment can be determined. Furthermore, he paused for emphasis, I have warrants for the arrest of anyone found to have participated in fraudulent assessment schemes. Whitfield stood so fast his chair fell over. I want immunity. I'll testify. I'll tell you everything. Sit down and shut up, Cutter growled, his hand moving toward his gun. Touch that weapon and you'll hang for it, Brennan said quietly. In front of 80 witnesses, including a federal marshal, think carefully about your next move. Cutter's hand stopped. The moment stretched, balanced on the edge of violence. Then Parsons spoke up, his lawyer's instinct for self-preservation overriding loyalty. My client maintains his innocence. These allegations require proper legal response, which we'll provide through appropriate channels. This is clearly not the venue for such serious accusations. Agreed. Brennan nodded. Mr. Hale, I'll need you to come with me for questioning. You're not under arrest yet, but I strongly suggest you cooperate. Hale's face had gone from cold to glacial. Am I being charged with anything? Not at this moment, but I've got enough evidence to make your life very complicated if you refuse to help clarify these matters. Then I'll have my attorneys present. Hale straightened his coat with precise movements, reasserting control through sheer force of will. This is far from over, Marshal. I have resources you can't imagine, connections that extend well beyond Montana territory. So do I. Brennan smiled without warmth. Difference is, mine are built on law instead of corruption. We'll see which holds up better. Hale turned to leave, then paused at the door. His gaze found Lydia, held her eyes with naked malice. You think you've won something, you haven't. Knowledge has value, Miss Vale, and one way or another I will acquire it. If not through cooperation, then through other means. Think about that in the coming weeks. Then he was gone, Parsons and Cutter following, leaving a wake of stunned silence. The silence broke gradually as people began to understand what had just happened. The auction was stopped. The debt was nullified. Hale's scheme had been exposed in the most public way possible. It wasn't complete victory. Hale was too powerful, too connected to fall easily. But it was something, a crack in the armor, proof that power could be challenged. Brennan approached Rhett and Lydia. You two made quite a bit of noise. That petition of yours reached some people in Helena who were already suspicious of Hale's land acquisitions. They asked me to look into it. Will he actually face charges? Lydia asked. Hard to say. Men like Hale insulate themselves well, but I've got enough to make him cautious, to limit his reach. And the investigation will be public, which means he can't operate as freely. Brennan studied them both. What you should know is that this doesn't end here. Hale's dangerous precisely because he works through systems. He'll find other ways to come after what he wants. Then we'll deal with those too, Rhett said. Will you? Brennan's gaze sharpened. Because from where I stand, you're still vulnerable. Calder, your land is safe for now, but Hale could challenge that through other channels. And Miss Vale, he turned to her. You're the real prize here. Your knowledge, your expertise. Hale said it himself. One way or another, he'll try to acquire it. You need to think about protection. Lydia straightened her spine. I can protect myself. Can you? Against hired men with no scruples? Against legal challenges that drain your resources? Against... He paused delicately. Against other women being put in danger to pressure you? What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you make your position legally unassailable. Establish formal rights to your research. Patent the methods if you need to. Not to restrict access, but to prevent Hale from doing exactly that. And consider... Brennan glanced at Rhett. Consider formalizing your arrangement here. A woman with a legal husband has protections a woman alone doesn't. The words hung between them. Rhett felt heat rise in his face, aware of the implications, the presumption. That's not... We're not. I know what you're not. Brennan's tone wasn't unkind. But I also know what Hale is. And he meant what he said. He'll come for her one way or another. You want to prevent that, you give her legal standing that's harder to challenge. Martha, who'd been listening nearby, stepped forward. The marshal's right. Out here, a woman alone is always vulnerable, no matter how strong or smart she is. Lydia, I'm not saying you need a man to protect you. I'm saying you need the law to recognize you as more than property waiting to be claimed. Lydia looked at Rhett, her expression unreadable. And what do you think? Rhett thought about the night in the saloon when he'd offered freedom instead of ownership. Thought about working beside her these past weeks, watching her transform dead land into life, seeing her fierce intelligence and uncompromising courage. Thought about the photographs on his mantle, Sarah and Emma, and the guilt that came with considering anything that felt like replacement. I think, he said slowly, that this should be your choice. Not Hale's, not the law's, not even mine. You've had your choices taken from you too many times already. I won't be another man doing that. Even if it means I'm vulnerable? Even then, better vulnerable and free than protected and owned. Something shifted in Lydia's eyes, warmth, perhaps, or recognition of something rare. She turned to Brennan. Thank you for the advice, Marshal. I'll consider it. Consider it quickly. Hale's not the waiting type. Brennan tipped his hat. I'll be in the territory another week conducting interviews. If either of you remember anything else suspicious, find me. He left, and the crowd began to disperse, people returning to farms and businesses with the kind of nervous energy that came from witnessing something they'd remember for years. The small farmers had watched power challenged and seen it blink first. That was worth something, even if the war wasn't over. Chen approached before they left. This was good day, but Marshall is right. Hale will try again. We should organize properly. Cooperative, maybe. Pool resources, share knowledge, create structure that's harder to attack than individuals. You've thought about this, Lydia said. In China, my family belonged to agricultural collective. Shared labor, shared risk, shared harvest. It worked until... He didn't finish, but the shadow in his eyes spoke of violence and loss. Here, maybe we do it better. Voluntary, democratic, but still together. I like it, Martha said. Count me in. Others who'd helped with the planting voiced agreement. By the time they finished discussing details, 19 families had committed to forming what Chen called the Willow Creek Agricultural Cooperative. They'd share equipment, labor, and knowledge. They'd document their methods and results. They'd stand together against pressure from men like Hale. It was fragile, this coalition of desperate farmers and radical ideas, but it was something. Riding back to the homestead, Rhett and Lydia were quiet for a long time. The morning's drama had left them both wrung out, adrenaline fading into exhaustion. But underneath the tiredness was something else. Relief, maybe, or the first genuine hope that survival might be possible. You could have agreed, Lydia said finally, to Brennan's suggestion. Force the issue for my own good. Could have, didn't want to. Why not? Rhett considered the question. Because the best thing anyone ever did for me was treat me like I had the right to make my own mistakes. Sarah did that. She saw me clearly, all my faults, all my weaknesses, and chose me anyway because I was mine to give, not hers to take. He paused. I figure I owe you the same courtesy. Even if it's reckless? Especially then. Recklessness brought you into my life in the first place. Seems wrong to object to it now. She laughed, surprising them both. It was a real laugh, warm and genuine, and Rhett realized he'd never heard that sound from her before. It made something in his chest tighten and release simultaneously. You're a strange man, Rhett called her. I've been told. They reached the homestead as sunset painted the mountains in shades of amber and gold. The fields spread before them, still impossibly green, still defying November's approach to winter. Molly made her way to the barn without direction, knowing the routine, and Rhett helped Lydia down before tending to the horse. Inside, Lydia started a fire while Rhett prepared a simple meal. They moved around each other with the ease of people who'd learned each other's rhythms, who'd worked side by side long enough that words weren't always necessary. Over dinner, they discussed the cooperative's next steps, the plantings they'd expand in spring, the documentation they needed to create. Practical matters, safer than addressing the larger questions hanging between them. But eventually, the practical topics ran out. The fire burned low. The silence stretched. Brennan was right about one thing, Lydia said quietly. Hale will come back. Maybe not directly, maybe not immediately, but he'll find ways to pressure us, to make our lives difficult until we give him what he wants. Let him try. We've got allies now. The cooperative, the marshal's investigation, public awareness, all of which could evaporate if Hale plays his cards right. You know that. She stared into the fire. I've been thinking about his threat, about what other means might look like. And I'm scared. The admission came quiet but firm. Not of him directly. I faced worse than Victor Hale. But of what happens to everyone around me if I stay. To you, to Martha, to the families in the cooperative. Hale's type doesn't fight fair. He'll find ways to hurt people I care about to get to me. Rhett moved to sit beside her. You thinking of leaving? I'm thinking that might be the smart choice. Pack up, disappear, take my knowledge somewhere Hale can't reach. Where would that be? He's got connections across the country. You said yourself he could contact your old professors, track you through your history. Then I'd have to become someone else. Again. The bitterness in her voice cut deep. Start over in a place where nobody knows me, build from nothing, always looking over my shoulder. That's not living, that's hiding. But it keeps other people safe. Rhett took her hand the first time he'd initiated that kind of contact. Her fingers were rough from work, strong and capable. Listen to me. You staying or going doesn't change who Hale is. Doesn't change that he'll keep crushing people to build his empire. Only difference is whether you're here fighting back or gone while he does it anyway. At least if I'm gone, he has no reason to target you specifically. Maybe. Or maybe he targets me anyway out of spite. Or maybe he just moves on to the next vulnerable person, the next piece of knowledge he can steal. Rhett squeezed her hand. Point is, running doesn't stop men like Hale. It just means you're not here when he strikes next. Lydia looked at their joined hands, then at his face. You're asking me to stay. I'm saying I want you to stay. But that's different from asking. Asking implies you owe me something. You don't. After everything you've risked for me? I didn't risk it for debt or obligation. I risked it because... He struggled for words. Because finding you reminded me that the world could still surprise me, that broken things could be useful, that giving up wasn't the only option. He managed a rough laugh. That's worth more than any debt you could owe. She studied him in the firelight, and he could see her thinking, calculating, weighing risks against possibilities. Finally, she spoke. If I stay, if we do this together, we do it properly. Not me hiding behind you, not you protecting me like I'm fragile cargo. We're partners, equal partners in whatever this becomes. Deal. And we formalize it legally, not marriage. She said it quickly, seeing his expression. Not unless we both want that for the right reasons. But a legal partnership for the land, the cooperative, the agricultural methods. Something that establishes my rights and makes it harder for Hale to claim I'm just your property or dependent. Makes sense. And we plan for the worst, weapons, allies, escape routes if needed. Hale won't quit, so neither can we. Agreed. Lydia took a breath, seemed to come to a decision. Then I'm staying. We're doing this. Together. They shook on it formally, sealing the agreement the way they'd sealed their first arrangement, with a handshake between equals. But this time, Rhett didn't let go immediately. He held her hand, feeling the calluses and strength, the warmth of human connection he'd forgotten he needed. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For being reckless enough to stay when anyone sensible would run. She smiled, that rare, genuine expression that transformed her whole face. You're welcome. Thank you for being reckless enough to win me in a card game when anyone sensible would have folded. They sat together as the fire died, planning their next moves, building their defense, preparing for the long fight ahead. Outside, winter continued its approach. Inside, two people who'd both learned that survival meant constant compromise decided that some things were worth refusing to compromise about. The land would test them. Hale would come for them. The frontier itself would try to break them like it broke everyone eventually, but they'd faced worse odds before. They'd planted crops in November and watched them grow. They'd challenged power with nothing but truth and determination and fragile community bonds. They'd gambled on impossible things and occasionally won. They could do it again. And when morning came, they'd begin exactly that, building something worth defending, brick by brick, choice by choice, together. The partnership papers were drawn up 3 days later by the lawyer from Butte, a sharp-eyed man named Morrison, who'd made his reputation defending miners against company towns. He listened to what Rhett and Lydia wanted: equal ownership of the land, joint control of agricultural methods, legal recognition of Lydia's expertise as intellectual property, and nodded thoughtfully. "Smart," he said, scratching notes with a pencil worn down to a nub. "Establishes you both as legitimate business partners, gives Miss Vale legal standing independent of marital status, and creates a framework for the cooperative. Hale will hate it, which means you're doing something right." "Can he challenge it?" Lydia asked. "He can challenge anything with enough lawyers and money, but this is solid. You're not trying to hide anything or claim rights you don't have. You're just formalizing an existing partnership." Morrison looked up at them. "The real question is, what happens when he escalates? Because he will." "We know," Rhett said. Morrison signed the documents with a flourish, then produced 2 more copies. "Keep one safe, file one with the territorial registry, and I'll hold the 3rd. That way, if anything happens to the originals, we've got backup." They filed the papers that afternoon, making it as public as possible. By evening, word had spread through Bitterroot Junction that Calder and Vale had formalized their partnership, that the woman who'd been won in a poker game now owned half the land that Victor Hale wanted. The gossip was vicious and varied. Some called it romantic, others called it calculated. Most just called it strange. Rhett didn't care what they called it. The papers were legal and binding, and Lydia now had protections that would make her harder to target. That was what mattered. But Morrison's warning proved prescient. Hale escalated 3 weeks later, and when he struck, it wasn't at Rhett or Lydia directly. It was at the cooperative. The first sign came when Jensen's barn burned. He'd been one of the early skeptics who'd eventually joined the cooperative after seeing the November crops thrive. The fire started in the middle of the night, consuming the structure and half his winter hay before anyone could respond. Jensen survived, but barely, and he stood in the ashes the next morning with a face like stone. "Cutter was in town yesterday," he said when Rhett and Lydia arrived. "Asked about my involvement with the cooperative. I told him to go to hell." This was the answer. "You can't prove that," Martha said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Don't need to prove it. We all know." Jensen kicked at a charred beam. "Question is what we do about it." 2 days later, Tom Briggs' cattle were driven off in the night. 40 head, most of his herd, vanished without a trace. The tracks led east toward Hale's territory before disappearing in rocky ground. Then William Chen's well was poisoned. The water turned foul with something that made his family sick for a week. The pattern was clear. Hale was punishing cooperative members systematically, making examples of them, demonstrating that opposition had costs. And because he operated through proxies and deniability, there was no legal recourse. Marshal Brennan was gone, back to Fort Benton with his investigation incomplete, and the local law belonged to Hale through money and fear. The cooperative met at Martha's barn 5 days after Jensen's fire. 23 families showed up, but the mood was darker than it had been. Fear had replaced hope, and people were starting to wonder if fighting was worth the cost. "We can't keep taking these hits," Jensen said flatly. "I'm ruined. Lost my barn, most of my equipment. Without it, I can't work my land, can't feed my family. How long before the rest of you are in the same position?" "So what are you saying?" Chen asked. "We give up? Let Hale win?" "I'm saying maybe we were foolish to think we could stand against him. He's got money, power, men willing to do violence. What do we have? Some crops that grew when they shouldn't have. That's not enough." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Rhett saw the cooperative fracturing in real time, saw the fear winning. He understood it. These were people who'd already survived so much, who'd come west looking for something better and found only different hardships. Asking them to risk everything they had left was asking too much. Lydia stood, and the room quieted. She looked different than she had that first night in the saloon, stronger, more certain, but also more aware of what was at stake. "You're right," she said, surprising everyone. "We can't beat Hale with force or money. We don't have either. But that was never the plan. Then what is the plan? Someone called out. We beat him with proof, with results so undeniable that the entire territory demands access to our methods. We make ourselves too valuable to crush. She gestured to the fields visible through the barn door. Those November crops aren't just growing, they're thriving. In 2 more weeks, we'll have actual harvest. Small, but real. Proof that the methods work at scale, not just on one test plot. Proof hail will steal or destroy, Jensen said bitterly. Not if we document everything and spread it far enough that destroying it becomes impossible. Well, Lydia pulled out a thick notebook, her agricultural journal, expanded and refined over weeks of work. I've written down every method, every principle, every technique. Chen's been helping me translate it into practical language that any farmer can follow. We're going to publish it. Publish how? Martha asked. As a manual. We'll print copies in Helena, distribute them across the territory. Make the knowledge so public that Hale can't claim it or control it. If anyone can access these methods, his threats become meaningless. He can't steal what's already been given away. The idea landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading as people considered the implications. It was radical, sharing agricultural knowledge freely when the standard practice was to guard trade secrets jealously. But it was also the only move that made sense. That takes money we don't have, Briggs pointed out. The Helena Independent offered to help, Lydia said. The editor contacted me after their first article. Said if we could provide something substantial, real documentation, proven results, they'd help publish it as a public service. Agricultural Innovation sells papers, apparently. And pisses off their biggest advertiser, Martha added. Hale owns stock in that newspaper. Not controlling stock, according to the editor. They've wanted an excuse to challenge him for years. This gives them one. Chen stood beside Lydia. I will help distribute. I know people, Chinese workers in mines, on railroads. They send letters home, spread word across territory faster than newspapers. If we give them something that helps their families farm, they will share it. Slowly, reluctantly, the mood began to shift. Not to hope exactly, but to something harder, determination born from having no other choice. They'd committed to this fight. Backing down now meant losing everything anyway, just slower. What about the violence? Jensen asked. My barn's still gone. Briggs's cattle are still missing. How does publishing a manual stop Hale from burning us out one by one? Rhett spoke for the first time. It doesn't, not directly, but it changes the calculation. Right now we're isolated targets, easy to pick off. Once we're publicly associated with something the whole territory wants access to, we become harder to touch without consequences. Hale operates through silence and fear. We take those away by being loud and fearless. Fearless, Jensen laughed without humor. You want me to be fearless when my livelihood just burned? No, I want you to be angry enough that fear doesn't matter. Rhett met his eyes. I spent 3 years being afraid of losing more, afraid of caring, afraid of hoping. It didn't protect me from anything, just made me smaller. Maybe it's time we all stopped being small. The words hit harder than Rhett expected. He saw it in faces around the room. Recognition, understanding, the particular kind of shame that came from realizing you'd been making yourself smaller to avoid pain. Martha broke the silence. Then we vote. Do we publish this manual and make ourselves visible, or do we disperse and hope Hale leaves us alone once we're not organized? They voted. It wasn't unanimous. 5 families chose to leave the cooperative, unwilling to risk more, but 18 stayed, and 18 was enough. The work began immediately. Lydia and Chen refined the manual, while others documented results from the various test plots. They took photographs, gathered testimony from farmers whose land had improved, compiled data on yields and soil quality. The Helena Independent sent a journalist to witness the harvest of the November crops. A small harvest, barely enough to feed a family for a week, but impossible nonetheless. The journalist, a young woman named Sarah Hoffman, walked the fields with undisguised amazement. This shouldn't be possible. Everyone knows winter kills crops. Winter kills poorly planned crops, Lydia corrected. These were chosen and arranged specifically to survive cold. The science has been understood for years. We're just applying it systematically. And you're giving this knowledge away for free? I'm giving it to people who need it. If that means Victor Hale can't profit from it, that's a bonus. The article Hoffman wrote was more than Lydia had hoped for. 3 full pages with photographs, detailed explanation of the methods, and pointed commentary about how agricultural innovation was being suppressed by wealthy interests who preferred to keep farmers desperate and dependent. She named Hale directly, connecting him to the pattern of property seizures and intimidation. It published on a Thursday. By Friday, the Helena Independence office had been vandalized, windows smashed, threats painted on the walls. The editor published those threats in Saturday's edition, along with an editorial about how violence proved they'd touched a nerve. The territory was paying attention now. Letters poured in from farmers across Montana asking for copies of the manual. The territorial governor was forced to comment, giving a carefully neutral statement about supporting agricultural development while respecting property rights. More newspapers picked up the story, some supportive, others calling it socialist propaganda that undermined individual enterprise. None of that mattered to Hale, who'd apparently decided that subtlety was no longer working. He came at dawn on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the auction that should have ended with him owning Rhett's land. He brought 12 men, not just Cutter and his usual enforcers, but hired guns from out of territory, hard men with dead eyes who killed for money and felt nothing about it. They rode up to the homestead in formation, surrounding the property before Rhett even knew they were coming. He woke to Molly's nervous whinnying and grabbed his rifle before he was fully conscious, instinct from warriors kicking in before thought could interfere. Lydia was already awake, standing at the window with her own rifle. She'd learned to shoot in the weeks since the auction, and she'd learned well. 12 riders, she said quietly. Hale's in the center. Get to the root cellar. It's defensible, and I'm not hiding while you fight my battles. This isn't your battle. It's about the land, the methods, the cooperative. All of it started with me. And none of it would exist without me. She checked her rifle's load with steady hands. We're partners, remember? Equal partners. That means we stand together or we both run. Your choice. Rhett thought about arguing, then recognized the futility. Lydia Vale had faced too much to hide now, and nothing he said would change that. Instead, he moved to the other window, giving them both firing positions. Hale called out from horseback, his voice carrying in the cold morning air. Calder, Miss Vale, I'm here to make one final offer before this becomes unpleasant. Seems pretty unpleasant already, Rhett shouted back, bringing 12 armed men to a farmhouse at dawn. Security, given recent tensions. Hale's tone was reasonable, almost gentle. I'm prepared to offer $20,000 for the land, the methods, and Miss Vale's agreement to stop distributing her manual. That's more than fair compensation. Not interested. $20,000, Calder. Enough to buy land anywhere in the territory, start fresh, live comfortably. All you have to do is walk away. And let you patent what should be free? Control knowledge that could help thousands of families? No deal. Then I'll take it anyway. Hale's reasonableness evaporated. That manual is derived from Cornell University research, which means it's intellectual property belonging to the institution. I've acquired the rights from them. I have documentation, which means distributing it without authorization is theft. I'm here to seize this property as compensation and to arrest Miss Vale for intellectual property violation. You're lying, Lydia called out. Cornell doesn't own independent research conducted by students. I checked before I left. Did you? Or did you assume because I have lawyers who'd argue differently and a territorial judge who'd rule in my favor? Hale smiled, visible even at this distance. You're out of moves, Miss Vale. The marshal is gone. Your newspaper allies can't protect you from legal process, and your cooperative friends are too scattered and afraid to help. Surrender now, and I'll be merciful. Refuse, and my men will extract you by force. Try it, Rhett said, sighting down his rifle. See how many of your hired guns make it back to Helena. You'd kill for this? Risk hanging for murder over crops and dirt? I've killed for less, and so have most of the men behind you, I'd wager. Difference is, I'll sleep fine afterward. Hale's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. Probably. I'm good at those. For a long moment, nothing happened. The standoff held, balanced on the edge of violence. Then one of Hale's men shifted, his hand moving toward his weapon, and Rhett knew the decision had been made. What happened next occurred too fast for thought. The hired gun drew, and Rhett fired, the rifle's crack splitting the dawn. The man fell, clutching his shoulder, not a killing shot, but enough to put him down. The other gunmen drew their weapons, and suddenly bullets were tearing through the cabin's walls, splintering wood and shattering glass. Rhett and Lydia returned fire, their shots methodical and aimed. They weren't trying to kill, just trying to make assault costly enough that Hale's men would reconsider. But the gunmen were professionals, and they spread out, using cover, advancing by increments. "We can't hold this," Lydia said, reloading with fingers that stayed steady despite the chaos. "They'll flank us in minutes." She was right. The cabin was defensible against a frontal assault, but 12 men could surround it, set it on fire, force them out into the open. This fight had one inevitable ending. Then Rhett heard something over the gunfire. Hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats, coming fast from the south. The first riders to appear were Chen and Martha, both armed, both faces set with grim determination. Behind them came more. Jensen, despite his burned barn. Briggs, despite his stolen cattle. Families from the cooperative, farmers who'd decided that running was worse than fighting, that Hale's violence proved their cause mattered. They weren't professional gunmen. They were farmers with old rifles and borrowed courage. But there were 30 of them, and they spread out in a loose perimeter around Hale's men, creating a situation where any continued violence would be mutual slaughter. The shooting stopped. Hale's hired guns recognized the mathematics. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and fighting for money instead of belief. Money was good, but it wasn't worth dying for when the odds turned bad. Chen rode forward, his rifle steady on his shoulder. "You leave now, peacefully, or we defend our cooperative member with whatever force necessary." "This is a legal seizure," Parsons sputtered, appearing from behind Hale's protective screen. "You're interfering with legitimate legal nothing," Martha cut him off. "You brought armed men to kill or kidnap members of our community. That's not law, that's banditry. We're within rights to defend against it." "You'll all hang for this," Hale said, his voice shaking with fury. "I'll see every one of you charged with interference, assault, conspiracy." "Do it," Jensen pushed forward. "Bring charges. Let's have a trial where we explain why you needed 12 gunmen to seize agricultural manuals. Let's make it public. Get newspapers involved. See how that plays when farmers across the territory are watching." The threat was clear. Hale's power depended on operating through legal channels and quiet violence. Force this into the open, make it a public spectacle, and he lost his most effective tools. And with 30 witnesses to what had just happened, he couldn't claim self-defense or legal authority. His face went through several colors before settling on cold calculation. "This isn't over." "Seems over to me," Martha said. "Unless you want to start shooting, which I'd reconsider given the odds." Hale stared at the assembled farmers, at the determined faces and ready weapons. Then he wheeled his horse around. "Let's go." His men followed, some nursing wounds, all of them aware they'd just lost something more important than a fight. They'd lost the narrative. The story of what happened here would spread, and it wouldn't be about Hale's legitimate legal seizure. It would be about a land baron bringing hired killers to silence innovation, only to be turned back by farmers defending their community. When the hoofbeats faded, Rhett stepped out of the cabin. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline catching up with him. Lydia followed, and they stood together facing the 30 people who'd risked everything to stand with them. "Thank you," Rhett managed. "You didn't have to." "Yes, we did," Chen interrupted. "This is what cooperative means. We stand together or we fall alone. Today, we stood." The others nodded, voiced agreement. They'd crossed a line, committed themselves in a way that couldn't be undone. But in their faces, Rhett saw something he recognized from his years in the army, the fierce pride of people who'd faced fear and not broken. Martha rode closer. "This'll make things worse before it gets better. Hale will try other ways, legal challenges, economic pressure, maybe more violence if he gets desperate enough." "Let him," Lydia said. "We've got something he doesn't, proof that our methods work, public support, and 30 families willing to defend what we've built. That's harder to crush than he realizes." She was right. Over the following weeks, as winter deepened and the cooperative's crops continued to thrive, the territory began to shift. The manual spread farther than Hale could track, printed and reprinted by newspapers and agricultural societies. Farmers who'd never heard of companion planting or nitrogen fixation started experimenting with the methods. Some failed. The manual couldn't account for every variable, but enough succeeded that word spread organically. Hale tried legal challenges, claiming intellectual property theft, but Morrison fought them with documentation showing that Lydia's research was independent and original. He tried economic pressure, using his business connections to deny credit and supplies to cooperative members, but the cooperative pooled resources and found alternative suppliers. He even tried appealing to the territorial governor for intervention, but by then public opinion had turned too far. Farmers across Montana were watching, and politicians recognized that taking Hale's side meant losing their votes. The final blow came in late January when Marshal Brennan returned from Fort Benton with federal charges. Not the tax fraud they'd originally investigated, that had been too tangled in territorial corruption to prosecute cleanly, but something better. Evidence of land fraud stretching back 5 years, forged deeds and falsified surveys affecting dozens of properties. The kind of systematic theft that even Hale's political connections couldn't protect him from. The trial was set for spring. Hale would survive it. Men like him always survived, but his power was broken. The investigation exposed networks of corruption that extended throughout the territorial government, forcing resignations and creating space for reform. The land he'd stolen was being returned. The officials he'd bribed were facing their own charges. It wasn't perfect justice. Hale would never see a jail cell, would probably rebuild his empire elsewhere using different methods. But for Montana Territory, for the farmers who'd stood together against him, it was enough. Spring came early that year, or at least it felt early to Rhett. The snow melted by mid-March, revealing fields that had survived winter better than any he'd seen. The companion crops had protected the soil from erosion, added nutrients, created conditions where spring planting could begin weeks ahead of normal schedule. The cooperative had grown to 47 families. They'd formalized their structure, elected Chen as chairman and Martha as treasurer, created bylaws that emphasized democratic decision-making and shared resources. It was messy and complicated and nothing like the independent farming Rhett had practiced before, but it worked. More importantly, it gave people hope. The kind of hope that came from seeing impossible things become real, from standing together against power and winning, from believing that the frontier could be something more than constant struggle and grinding survival. Rhett stood in his field on a warm April morning, watching Lydia direct a group of new farmers in soil preparation techniques. She'd become a teacher without meaning to, her expertise sought by people across the territory. Universities back east had even contacted her, offering positions with better pay and more prestige than anything Montana could provide. She'd turned them all down. "Why would I leave?" she'd said when Rhett asked. "Everything I wanted to accomplish, I'm accomplishing here. Plus, the land still needs work. We've proven the methods work, but there's so much more to learn about adapting them to different conditions, different elevations, different soil types. That's years of research. You could do that research anywhere." "I could, but I like the people here. I like the work. I like—" She'd paused, choosing words carefully. "I like not being alone anymore." Neither was Rhett. The photographs on the mantle were still there. Sarah and Emma would always be there. But they'd been joined by new images. Pictures of the November harvest, of the cooperative's founding meeting, of 30 farmers standing together against Hale's hired guns. Pictures of a life being built instead of merely survived. He and Lydia had formalized their partnership in another way 3 months earlier, standing before a territorial judge with Martha and Chen as witnesses. Not because either of them needed legal protection anymore. Lydia's reputation and the cooperative's success had made her untouchable in ways marriage never could. But because somewhere between planting impossible crops and standing against impossible odds, they'd decided they wanted to. The wedding had been small, practical, focused more on the legal partnership than romance. But when Rhett had looked at Lydia in that judge's office, when she'd looked back at him with those fierce eyes that had first caught his attention in a smoke-filled saloon, something had shifted. The space between partnership and marriage wasn't as wide as he'd thought. The line between choosing to stand together and choosing to love wasn't as clear. Sarah would have understood. She'd always said that love wasn't about replacing people. It was about having enough courage to keep opening your heart, even when loss made that terrifying. Rhett thought he finally understood what she'd meant. "You planning to work or just stand there looking contemplative?" Lydia called out, breaking his reverie. She was smiling, that rare expression that still surprised him when it appeared. "Thinking about how we got here." "Luck and recklessness, mostly." That's one interpretation. She walked over, brushing soil from her hands. The April sun caught the gold in her hair, illuminated the freckles that hard work and outdoor life had multiplied across her nose. She looked healthy, strong, happy in ways that went deeper than simple contentment. "I've been thinking too," she said, "about expansion. Martha's got neighbors willing to join the cooperative. If we can help them convert their land using our methods, we could double our productive acreage by next year." Ambitious. We've earned ambitious. After everything we've survived, I think we're allowed to aim high. Rhett pulled her close, feeling the solid warmth of her against him. "I love you," he said, surprising them both. They'd never actually spoken the words aloud, had let actions and choices do the talking instead. Lydia leaned back to look at him, her expression serious. "Why now?" "Because it's true. Because I want you to know. Because—" He struggled for words. "Because when I won you in that poker game, I thought I was gambling on change. Turns out, I was gambling on the rest of my life." "Best hand you ever played?" "By far." She kissed him then, warm and certain, a promise and an affirmation all at once. When they broke apart, she was smiling again. "I love you too. Even though you're reckless and stubborn and have terrible taste in card games, those are my best qualities." "I know, that's the problem." They stood together in the field where dead land had learned to live again, where impossible things had become ordinary through hard work and determination and the willingness to bet everything on fragile hope. Around them, the cooperative was growing, literally and figuratively. Farmers were learning new methods, families were thriving, the territory was changing, one planted seed at a time. It wasn't the life Rhett had imagined when he'd buried Sarah and Emma. Wasn't the future Lydia had pictured when she fled Cornell and Crown and everything that had tried to make her smaller than she was? But it was real. It was theirs. And it was worth every impossible gamble they'd made to get here. In the distance, Chen was organizing a work crew for a new member's property. Martha was teaching a young farmer about soil pH testing. Jensen, his barn rebuilt with cooperative labor, was sharing what he'd learned about frost-resistant wheat varieties. The community they'd built, fragile and imperfect and absolutely necessary, was functioning exactly as it should. Lydia rested her head against Rhett's shoulder. "You know what the best part is? Tell me. We're not done. This is just the beginning. There's so much more land to reclaim, so many more families to help, so much more knowledge to share. We could spend the rest of our lives on this and barely scratch the surface." Rhett thought about that. Decades of work ahead, challenges and setbacks guaranteed, no promises of easy success. A year ago, that prospect would have felt like a burden. Now it felt like purpose. "Then we'd better get started," he said. They walked back toward the cabin together, partners in every sense that mattered. Behind them, the field stretched green and alive under the Montana sky. Ahead of them, a future waited to be built through the same reckless courage that had brought them this far. Somewhere in Helena, Victor Hale was probably plotting his next move, nursing his wounded pride, planning revenge. Let him. The cooperative was stronger than one man's spite, and the knowledge Lydia had shared couldn't be taken back or controlled. It belonged to everyone now, spreading across the territory like those November crops, impossible, unstoppable, alive. That night, after the work was done and the cooperative members had returned to their own homes, Rhett and Lydia sat on their porch watching stars appear. The mountains rose around them, ancient and indifferent. The creek ran its eternal course. And two people who'd both learned that survival meant constant compromise sat together in comfortable silence, having finally found something worth refusing to compromise about. "You ever regret it?" Lydia asked quietly. "That card game? Taking the risk?" Rhett thought about the question seriously, thought about everything that had followed, the danger, the violence, the constant struggle against forces that should have crushed them. Thought about what he'd gained, purpose, partnership, love he'd thought was gone forever. "Not for a second," he said. "Good. Because I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air for a moment before Rhett's mind caught up with them. He turned to look at her, saw the mixture of hope and fear in her expression, the vulnerability that she so rarely showed. "How long have you known?" "A week. I wanted to be sure before I told you. I know this changes things, adds complications we didn't plan for." He kissed her, silencing the worried words. When he pulled back, he was smiling, really smiling, the kind of expression he'd forgotten his face could make. This doesn't change things. This makes them better. Harder, probably. Definitely more complicated, but better. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything. He pulled her close, feeling the life they'd created together in all its forms, the partnership, the cooperative, the land brought back from death, and now this. A child. A future that extended beyond their own lives into something larger and more permanent. What do we name it? Lydia asked. We've got months to figure that out. I want to name her Hope. If it's a girl, why Hope? Because that's what all of this has been about. Taking reckless gambles on hope when anyone sensible would choose despair. Planting crops that shouldn't grow. Fighting power that shouldn't lose. Building futures that shouldn't exist. She looked at him with those fierce eyes that had first caught his attention in a saloon filled with men who'd dismissed her as worthless. Hope is the most radical thing we've got. Seems right to name our daughter after it. Rhett thought about his own daughters. Emma, gone too soon, but never forgotten. About the way loss had taught him to close his heart, and how Lydia had taught him to open it again. About the gamble he'd made in that saloon, and all the gambles that followed, each one a small rebellion against the frontier's cruel certainty that nothing good could last. Hope, he agreed. And if it's a boy? You choose. He thought for only a moment. Chance, because that's what brought us together. Chance and recklessness and the willingness to bet everything on a hand we knew we probably shouldn't play. Lydia laughed, warm and genuine. Hope and chance, the frontier's going to have opinions about that. The frontier can cope. They sat together as darkness fell completely, planning a future that would be built on the same foundation as everything else they'd accomplished. Hard work, determination, community, and the radical belief that impossible things could become real if you were willing to fight for them. The land would test them. Winter would come again. Hale or men like him would find new ways to challenge what they'd built. But they'd faced worse. They'd planted crops in November and watched them grow. They'd stood against power with nothing but truth and fragile hope. They'd gambled on love in a territory that punished gentleness and won anyway. They could face whatever came next. And when their child was born the following spring, a daughter with Lydia's fierce eyes and Rhett's stubborn determination, she arrived into a world that was changing. The cooperative had spread to 6 counties. Agricultural colleges were studying the methods documented in Lydia's manual. Farmers who'd been on the edge of giving up were harvesting crops they'd thought impossible. The Montana Territory was learning that dead land could live again, that broken people could build something whole, that the frontier rewarded not just strength but cooperation and innovation and the courage to try radical things. Hope Calder came into a world her parents had made better by refusing to accept that better was impossible. And as Rhett held his daughter for the first time, feeling the weight of new life in his arms, he understood finally what Sarah had tried to tell him in those last fever-bright moments before she died. Loss was real, grief was real. But so was this. The stubborn insistence on continuing, on planting seeds even in November, on believing that morning would come even in the darkest night. That was the gamble that mattered most, not the reckless bet in a saloon, not the impossible crops or the stand against hail or any single moment of courage. The real gamble was choosing to keep living fully, even when loss made that terrifying. Choosing to open your heart again. Choosing to build futures instead of merely surviving presents. Choosing hope over despair, action over resignation, love over fear. That was the bet Rhett and Lydia had made together, and it paid dividends beyond anything either of them had imagined. Not in money or power or even in security, but in something more valuable, a life that mattered, work that helped others, love that grew instead of diminished, and children who would inherit not just land, but the knowledge that impossible things could become real if you were brave enough to try. The Montana frontier was hard country that broke most people eventually. But some people broke it back, reshaping it through sheer stubborn determination into something that could sustain not just survival, but actual life. Rhett and Lydia were those people, and the legacy they built, the cooperative, the methods, the community, would outlast them both, proof that the worthless cargo won in a reckless poker hand had been the most valuable thing either of them ever found. Years later, when Hope was old enough to ask how her parents met, they told her the truth. About the saloon, the cards, the impossible gamble, about crops that shouldn't have grown and battles that shouldn't have been won, about choosing each other when anyone sensible would have walked away. And Hope, who'd inherited her mother's fierce intelligence and her father's reckless courage, understood the lesson beneath the story, that the frontier didn't reward strength alone, but those bold enough to see value where others saw nothing, to plant seeds even in November, to gamble everything on the fragile, impossible, desperately important belief that broken things could be rebuilt and dead land could live again. That was the story of Rhett Calder and Lydia Vale. Not a fairy tale where everything worked out perfectly, but something better. A real story about real people who'd faced real darkness and chosen light anyway, who'd been given every reason to give up and instead planted seeds, who'd learned that the best gambles weren't the safe ones, but the reckless ones made with open eyes and willing hearts. And in the end, those were the gambles that changed the world.